You already knew you were right. You just didn't say it. And somehow that bothers people more than if you had fought back. There's a reason for that. And it has nothing to do with confidence or courage or finally learning to speak up. It has to do with how your mind is actually built. Most people carry a very fixed idea of what winning an argument looks like. Loud, fast, decisive, the quick comeback. The line that shuts everything down. The moment where someone goes visibly quiet because you just dismantled their entire position in real time in front of everyone watching. That version of winning gets celebrated. Social media turns it into content. Movies treat it like a superpower. And for a certain kind of mind, it works perfectly fine. For yours, it doesn't. Not because you're slow. Not because you're passive. Not because you lack the nerve. But because your brain is running a completely different program and nobody ever handed you the manual for it. The experience most people with this kind of mind know deeply is this. You're in a conversation that turns into something heated. Someone says something wrong or unfair or both. Every part of you registers it. But instead of firing back, something in you goes very quiet. You take it in. You watch. You hold it. And then hours later, alone, the perfect response arrives. Fully formed, precisely worded, devastatingly accurate. 3 hours too late. In French, there's a phrase for this. Esprit de l'escalier. The spirit of the staircase. The thing you thought of on your way out. But what nobody tells you about that experience is that it isn't a failure of speed. It is evidence of a processing system that is too sophisticated for the environment it was placed in. You weren't absent during that argument. You were doing something the loudest person in the room is completely incapable of doing. You were thinking at a depth that the room didn't have the resolution to see. This video isn't about debate tactics. It isn't about becoming more aggressive or finally summoning the courage to confront people head on. It's about understanding why you experience conflict the way you do. Why every conventional piece of advice about standing your ground has always felt slightly off for you, and why the thing everyone keeps reading as your weakness is actually one of the most sophisticated cognitive traits a human mind can carry. The problem has never been the trait. The problem is the context it's been placed in, and the complete absence of anyone ever explaining how to actually use it. Let's start with what the dominant cultural story says about conflict, because that story is doing real damage to a specific kind of person. The widely accepted idea is that the person who wins an argument is the person who holds their ground in the moment, who doesn't flinch, who responds quickly, confidently, and visibly, who can perform composure under pressure and make the other person look wrong in real time. This is what we might call the sprint model of conflict. It rewards speed above accuracy, volume above depth. Whoever is most comfortable being uncomfortable in that exact moment controls the room. And if you have ever tried to force yourself into that model, you know precisely what happens. The thoughts tangle. Words arrive in the wrong sequence. There's a pressure in your chest that feels almost physical, like trying to access something essential through a door that will not open. And then afterward, when you're alone and the pressure has lifted, the door swings wide open and everything is clear, which means the intelligence was always there. It simply couldn't surface in the conditions the moment demanded. That is not a character flaw. That is a biological reality, and it starts to make complete sense once you understand what's actually happening in your brain during conflict. There is a concept in psychology called vantage sensitivity, and it reframes nearly everything about how a mind like yours functions. Most conversations about sensitivity treat it as a liability. Too emotional, too reactive, too affected by things that other people seem to move through without effort. But vantage sensitivity describes something structurally different. It describes a trait where certain individuals are more responsive to their environment in both directions simultaneously. Yes, they are more affected by stress and social friction, but they are also more capable of detecting nuance, reading subtext, tracking the emotional undercurrents of a situation, and picking up on information that most people never consciously register at all. In a conflict, while the other person is simply loading their next attack, you are unconsciously cataloging the micro shift in their posture, the word they chose instead of a slightly different word, and what that choice reveals, the contradiction between what they said 10 minutes ago and what they're saying now, and the fear that is living just underneath the aggression. You are reading the room at a depth that the room doesn't know is possible. And because you're doing it automatically, without choosing to, it doesn't feel like an advantage. It feels like being flooded. There is another concept that sits beside this one, and it fills in the rest of the picture. It's called low latent inhibition. In most brains, there is a filter, a perceptual gate that screens out information deemed irrelevant and allows a person to focus efficiently on what's directly in front of them. This filter is called latent inhibition, and it is a feature of a brain optimized for speed and social performance in normal conditions. People with low latent inhibition have a weaker version of that gate. More information gets through, more sensory detail, more pattern recognition across unrelated things, more association between the present moment and 17 other moments that somehow feel connected. In calm, open environments, this is the cognitive profile of artists, original thinkers, strategists, and people who solve problems that nobody else could see clearly enough to even define. In a heated, time-pressured argument, it is the profile of someone running 15 parallel threads of analysis while simultaneously being asked to produce a confident, emotionally neutral, perfectly timed sentence in under 3 seconds. The freeze is not weakness. The freeze is what happens when a system built for depth gets dropped into a game that was designed entirely for speed. Now here is the piece of this that almost never gets acknowledged, and it matters more than anything else in this conversation. Traits like these don't exist by accident. Every group of human beings that survived long enough to become your ancestors contained a distribution of psychological types. Not everyone was built to be a warrior. Not everyone was built to be an explorer or a hunter or a confrontational decision maker. Some individuals were built to stay back and observe, to notice what others missed, to remember what happened last time and understand what it meant, to sense that the person making the loudest argument was afraid, not confident, and to hold that information quietly until the right moment. These individuals didn't win confrontations through force. They shaped outcomes through timing, precision, and an understanding of the situation that went deeper than anyone else in the group could access. They were often quiet. They were frequently misread. And they were completely essential to the survival of everyone around them. What you carry is not a modern malfunction. It is an ancient design, one that the modern world has simply stopped creating a context for. To make this more useful, it helps to have a framework, a shape for it. Think about argument types the way you think about terrain. Some people are built for open ground and short distance. A sprint, fast, loud, reactive, and resolved in the moment. The sprint argument feels decisive because it's immediate. The energy is visible. The winner is announced. But what a sprint argument gains in speed, it almost always loses in accuracy. The person who wins a sprint argument usually wins on performance, not correctness. They win because they are the most comfortable person in the discomfort. That is a real skill. It is just not your skill. Your skill is something closer to deep water navigation. In deep water, speed is not what keeps you oriented. Awareness is. Reading currents beneath the surface. Understanding what's moving below what's visible. Knowing when stillness is more intelligent than momentum. Deep water navigators don't fight the ocean. They understand it well enough to let it carry them where they need to go. When you go quiet in a conflict, you are not retreating. You are doing exactly what deep water navigation requires. You are reading the current before you commit to a direction. The problem is that you have spent most of your life being evaluated by sprint standards and being told in various ways that your silence is the absence of something rather than the presence of something else entirely. This is also why almost every conventional piece of advice about conflict has failed you. Be more assertive. Don't let people walk all over you. Say what you feel in the moment before the moment passes. These are sprint strategies being handed to a deep water navigator. They don't just fail to help. They actively work against the architecture of how your mind is designed to function. When you force yourself to argue the way a sprinter would, you experience something that feels like cognitive freezing and walk away feeling worse, not because you lost, but because you were playing a game that was designed by someone who has never experienced the inside of a mind like yours. So let's talk about what winning actually looks like for you, because it requires separating two things that almost everyone conflates: the moment of the argument and the outcome of the argument. Most people treat these as the same thing. The exchange is the battlefield, and whoever stands tallest when it ends has won. But this is a shallow reading of how influence actually works. The real outcome of any conflict is what the other person believes, feels, or does after the argument is over. And the person who most effectively shapes that outcome is almost never the loudest person in the room. It's the person who said one precise, clear, true thing at exactly the right moment with no emotional noise around it. Because that kind of statement doesn't land in the reactive brain. It bypasses it entirely and arrives somewhere quieter, somewhere that does the actual work of changing a mind. This is not a metaphor. When someone is in the reactive, high arousal state that most arguments produce, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for reasoning, updating beliefs, and integrating new information, is significantly less active. The emotional brain is running the show, trying to win a rational argument with someone whose rational brain is currently offline is like trying to have a conversation through a door that is bolted from the inside. You can be completely correct and be entirely unheard. But the moment the emotional charge drops, the moment the person is alone with their thoughts and the heat has left the room, the prefrontal cortex comes back online. And that's when the thing you said quietly, without heat, without performance, starts doing its work. You are not trying to win the moment. You are placing something true into the current and trusting it to travel. That is not passivity. That is the most sophisticated form of influence available to a human being. Now let's get practical, because understanding this intellectually is one thing, and having it change the actual texture of your life is another. The approaches here aren't tactics to memorize. They are design choices, ways of operating that align with how your mind actually works rather than fighting against it at every turn. The first design choice is what we can call the single-sentence strategy. In any conflict, your instinct is to hold back because you have too many things to say and no clear place to start. Instead of fighting that instinct, work with it differently. Give yourself permission to say only one thing, one sentence, not a rebuttal, not a defense, not everything you're thinking, just the most essential truth in the room. Something that reframes the situation rather than counters it. Something like noticing aloud what the conversation is actually about beneath what it appears to be about. This does two things simultaneously. It signals to the other person that you are not emotionally reactive, which immediately shifts the relational dynamic in a way that volume never could. And it introduces a perspective they weren't expecting, which creates a gap in their position without you ever having to argue against it directly. You are not pushing back. You are redirecting the entire current of the conversation with a single, precise movement. The second design choice is temporal displacement, which is the deliberate practice of removing yourself from the expectation that the argument must be resolved right now. Most people feel an intense internal pressure to win the exchange in real time, before the conversation ends, before the other person walks away looking like they got the last word. That pressure is a sprint impulse, and it is not native to you. It's been conditioned into you by years of being in environments that reward speed. When you feel that pressure arrive, you can name it internally and consciously release it. You can say, either inside or out loud, that you need more time before you respond. This is not avoidance. When you return to a conversation an hour later, or a day later, with your thoughts settled and your processing complete, you are operating at your actual capacity. The other person, who spent that time feeling like they won, now encounters a version of you that is calm, clear, and precisely prepared. The game has changed entirely, and they don't always know why. The third design choice is mirroring with subtraction. This is one of the quietest and most effective tools available to a mind wired the way yours is. When someone is making an argument you believe is wrong or unfair, instead of countering it, you reflect a portion of it back with all the emotional charge removed. You strip away the rhetoric and return only the content in its plainest possible form. So what you're saying is, followed by the most neutral version of their position. What this does is force the other person to hear their own argument in a register that is clear enough to examine. And very often, in that neutral version, the flaws become visible to them without you having to point them out. You are not fighting the current. You are removing the current and showing both of you what's sitting underneath it. The fourth design choice is outcome anchoring. Before you enter any significant conflict, ask yourself one question. Not how do I win this, but what do I actually want to be true after this conversation is over? The answer to that question becomes your reference point for every choice you make during the exchange. Every word you consider saying gets evaluated against it. If the devastating comeback you thought of doesn't move you closer to the outcome you actually want, you don't say it. Not because you're being passive, because you are being precise. And that precision, that discipline of purpose, is something that people who argue loudly and frequently almost never develop, because the sprint model doesn't require it. There's a warning that needs to be named here because it will come, and if you're not expecting it, it will feel like evidence that none of this is working when it isn't. When you first start operating this way deliberately and consciously, it will feel wrong. The other person will still seem to walk away looking like they won. People around you may still interpret your quiet as agreement or compliance. Your nervous system, which has calibrated itself over years to interpret silence as a kind of danger, will keep sending signals that you should have said more. This discomfort is not failure. It is recalibration. The results of operating this way don't appear in the immediate exchange. They appear in the quality of what happens around you over the following weeks and months. People begin to trust your judgment in a different way. They come to you when they want an honest read on something, not a performance. They notice, often without being able to articulate why, that you don't waste words. And gradually, without any announcement, you become the person in the room whose silence carries more weight than everyone else's noise. It's also worth understanding something true about the people who argue loudly and win the sprint. High volume, high speed argument is very frequently a compensatory strategy. It is what happens when someone doesn't trust that their position can survive real scrutiny, so they prevent scrutiny from ever forming by moving too fast for it to catch up. The aggression in a sprint argument is often a form of fear dressed in the clothing of confidence. When you recognize that, not as a way to dismiss the other person, but simply as accurate information, it changes everything about how you relate to the conflict. You stop experiencing yourself as someone facing a more capable opponent. You start seeing someone using the only strategy available to them. And from that vantage point, the power dynamic is completely different from what the surface of the situation suggested. Now let's talk about what happens inside you after a conflict ends, because for many people wired this way, the real difficulty isn't the argument itself. It's the hours of replay that follow. The internal courtroom that reopens the case, re-examines every word, every silence, every alternative path that could have been taken. This process is exhausting, and it is often misread as anxiety or rumination, which it can become if it's left without structure. But at its root, what you're doing is analyzing, extracting pattern and meaning from a social experience with the same instinct that makes you good at everything else requiring depth. The way to work with this rather than against it is to give it a boundary and a purpose. After a significant conflict, allow yourself a short, deliberate period of review. Not to punish yourself, not to replay the worst moments on repeat, but to extract one or two genuine observations. What did you learn about the other person? What did you learn about the situation that you didn't know when you walked in? What would you do differently, not because you failed, but because you are refining your understanding of your own design? When the analytical instinct has a purpose, it stops cycling and starts producing. The replay becomes useful rather than corrosive. Here is something you can say to yourself when you're standing in the middle of a conflict, and you feel that familiar flood of overwhelm beginning to rise. Not as a mantra, not as a performance, as a genuinely accurate description of what is happening. I am processing more than this moment requires. I don't need to respond to all of it. I need to find the one true thing and say only that. That's the whole script. It gives the processing instinct a clear and singular target. It reminds you that quiet is not the absence of power. Quiet is what happens when power has nothing left to prove. You are not someone who struggles with conflict because you are too sensitive, or too avoidant, or somehow constitutionally unequipped for the reality of disagreement. You are someone whose cognitive design operates at a resolution that most conflict environments were not built to accommodate. That is not your problem to solve by becoming someone else. It is your context to understand clearly, so that what you already do naturally can become deliberately effective. The deep water navigator doesn't become more useful by learning to sprint. They become more useful by learning to read the water they're already swimming in. If this landed somewhere real for you, there is a connected conversation worth having. It's about why certain people carry a low but constant hum of tension even in the complete absence of conflict, and what that pattern reveals about a nervous system that learned to anticipate pressure before it arrives. It explains something that has probably been quietly confusing you for a long time. That video is there when you're ready for it.